450 from Paddington, a mystery novel by Agatha Christie. Chapter 1. Mrs. McGillicuddy panted along the platform in the wake of the porter carrying her suitcase. Mrs. McGillicuddy was short and stout, and the porter was tall and free-striding. In addition, Mrs. McGillicuddy was burdened with a large quantity of parcels, the result of a day's Christmas shopping. The race was therefore an even one, and the porter turned the corner at the end of the platform whilst Mrs. McGillicuddy was still coming up the straight. Number 1 platform was not at the moment unduly crowded, since a train had just gone out, but in the no-man's land beyond, a milling crowd was rushing in several directions at once, to and from undergrounds, left luggage offices, tea rooms, inquiry offices, indicator boards, and the 2 outlets, arrival and departure, to the outside world. Mrs. McGillicuddy and her parcels were buffeted to and fro, but she arrived eventually at the entrance to number 3 platform and deposited 1 parcel at her feet whilst she searched her bag for the ticket that would enable her to pass the stern, uniformed guardian at the gate. At that moment, a voice, raucous yet refined, burst into speech over her head. "The train standing at platform 3, the voice told her, is the 450 for Brackhampton, Milchester, Waverton, Carville Junction, Wroxeter, and stations to Chadmouth. Passengers for Brackhampton and Milchester travel at the rear of the train. Passengers for Vanquay change at Wroxeter." The voice shut itself off with a click and then reopened conversation by announcing the arrival at platform 9 of 435 from Binghamton and Wolverhampton. Mrs. McGillicuddy found her ticket and presented it. The man clipped it, murmured, "On the right, rear portion." Mrs. McGillicuddy padded up the platform and found her porter looking bored and staring into space outside the door of a third-class carriage. "Here you are, lady." "I'm traveling first class," said Mrs. McGillicuddy. "You didn't say so," grumbled the porter. His eye swept her masculine-looking pepper and salt tweed coat disparagingly. Mrs. McGillicuddy, who had said so, did not argue the point. She was sadly out of breath. The porter retrieved the suitcase and marched with it to the adjoining coach where Mrs. McGillicuddy was installed in solitary splendor. The 450 was not much patronized, the first-class clientele preferring either the faster morning express or the 6:40 with dining car. Mrs. McGillicuddy handed the porter his tip, which he received with disappointment, clearly considering it more applicable to third-class than to first-class travel. Mrs. McGillicuddy, though prepared to spend money on comfortable travel after a night journey from the north and a day's feverish shopping, was at no time an extravagant tipper. She settled herself back on plush cushions with a sigh and opened her magazine. 5 minutes later, whistles blew and the train started. The magazine slipped from Mrs. McGillicuddy's hand. Her head dropped sideways. 3 minutes later, she was asleep. She slept for 35 minutes and awoke refreshed. Resettling her hat, which had slipped askew, she sat up and looked out of the window at what she could see of the flying countryside. It was quite dark now, a dreary, miserly December day. Christmas was only 5 days ahead. London had been dark and dreary. The country was no less so, though occasionally rendered cheerful with its constant clutters of lights, and the train flashed through towns and stations. "Serving last tea now," said an attendant, whisking open the corridor like a djinn. Mrs. McGillicuddy had already partaken of tea at a large department store. She was for the moment amply nourished. The attendant went on down the corridor, uttering his monotonous cry. "Serving last tea now." Mrs. McGillicuddy looked up at the rack where her various parcels reposed with a pleased expression. The face towels had been excellent value and just what Margaret wanted. The space gun for Robbie and the rabbit for Jean were highly satisfactory, and the evening coatee was just the thing she herself needed. Warm but dressy, the pullover for Hector too. Her mind dwelt with approval on the soundness of her purchases. Her satisfied gaze returned to the window. A train traveling in the opposite direction rushed by with a screech, making the windows rattle and causing her to start. The train clattered over points and passed through a station. Then it began suddenly to slow down, presumably in obedience to a signal. For some moments, it crawled along, then stopped. Presently, it began to move forward again. Another up train passed them, though with less vehemence than the first one. The train gathered speed again. At that moment, another train, also on a down line, swerved inwards towards them, for a moment with almost alarming effect. For a time, the two trains ran parallel, now one gaining a little, now the other. Mrs. McGillicuddy looked from her window through the windows of the parallel carriages. Most of the blinds were down, but occasionally the occupants of the carriages were visible. The other train was not very full, and there were many empty carriages. At that moment, when the two trains gave the illusion of being stationary, a blind in one of the carriages flew up with a snap. Mrs. McGillicuddy looked into the lighted first-class carriage that was only a few feet away. Then she drew her breath in with a gasp and half rose to her feet. Standing with his back to the window and to her was a man. His hands were round the throat of a woman who faced him, and he was slowly, remorselessly strangling her. Her eyes were staring from their sockets. Her face was purple and congested, and Mrs. McGillicuddy watched fascinated. The end came. The body went limp and crumpled in the man's hands. At that moment, Mrs. McGillicuddy's train slowed down again, and the other began to gain speed. It passed forward, and a moment or two later, it had vanished from sight. Almost automatically, Mrs. McGillicuddy's hand went up to the communication cord, then paused, irresolute. After all, what use would it be ringing the cord of the train in which she was traveling? The horror of what she had seen at close quarters and the unusual circumstances made her feel paralyzed. Some immediate action was necessary. But what? The door of a compartment was drawn back and a ticket collector said, "Ticket, please." Mrs. McGillicuddy turned to him with vehemence. "A woman has been strangled," she said, "in a train that has just passed. I saw it." The ticket collector looked at her doubtfully. "I beg your pardon, madam." "A man strangled a woman in a train. I saw it through there." She pointed to the window. The ticket collector looked extremely doubtful. "Strangled?" he said disbelievingly. "Yes, strangled. I saw it. I tell you, you must do something at once." The ticket collector coughed apologetically. "You don't think, madam, that you may have had a little nap and, He broke off tactfully. "I have had a nap, but if you think this was a dream, you're quite wrong. I saw it. I tell you." The ticket collector's eyes dropped to the open magazine lying on the seat. On the exposed page was a girl being strangled whilst a man with a revolver threatened the pair from an open doorway. He said persuasively, "Now don't you think, madam, that you'd been reading an exciting story and that you had just dropped off and awakened a little confused?" Mrs. McGillicuddy interrupted him. "I saw it. I was as wide awake as you are, and I looked out of the window into the window of the train alongside, and a man was strangling a woman. And what I want to know is, what are you going to do about it?" "Well, madam, you're going to do something, I suppose." The ticket collector sighed reluctantly, glanced at his watch. "We shall be at Binghamton in exactly 7 minutes. I'll report what you've told me. In what direction was the train you mentioned going?" This direction, of course. You don't suppose I'd have been able to see this if a train had flashed past going in the other direction? The ticket collector looked as though he thought Mrs. McGillicuddy was quite capable of seeing anything anywhere as the fancy took her. But he remained polite. You can rely on me, madam. I will report your statement. Perhaps I might have your name and address, just in case. Mrs. McGillicuddy gave him the address where she would be staying for the next few days and her permanent address in Scotland, and he wrote them down. Then he withdrew with the air of a man who has done his duty and dealt successfully with a tiresome member of the traveling public. Mrs. McGillicuddy remained frowning and vaguely unsatisfied. Would the ticket collector report her statement? Or had he just been soothing her down? There was, she supposed vaguely, a lot of elderly women traveling around, fully convinced that they had unmasked communist plots, were in danger of being murdered, saw flying saucers and secret spaceships, and reported murders that had never taken place. If the man dismissed her as one of those... The train was slowing down now, passing over points and running through the bright lights of a large town. Mrs. McGillicuddy opened her handbag, pulled out a receipted bill, which was all she could find, wrote a rapid note on the back of it with her ball pen, put it in a spare envelope that she fortunately happened to have, stuck the envelope down, and wrote on it. The train drew slowly into a crowded platform. The usual ubiquitous voice was intoning, "The train now arriving at platform 1 is a 5:38 for Milchester, Waverton, Wroxeter, and stations to Chadmouth. Passengers for Market Basing take the train now waiting at number 3 platform. Number 1 bay for stopping train to Carbury." Mrs. McGillicuddy looking anxiously along the platform. So many passengers and so few porters. Ah, there was one. She hailed him authoritatively. "Porter, please take this at once to station master's office." She handed him the envelope, and with it a shilling. Then, with a sigh, she leaned back. Well, she had done what she could. Her mind lingered with an instant's regret on the shilling. 6pence would really have been enough. Her mind went back to the scene she had witnessed. Horrible, quite horrible. She was a strong-nerved woman, but she shivered. What a strange, what a fantastic thing to happen to her. Elspeth McGillicuddy, if the blind of the carriage had not happened to fly up. But that, of course, was Providence. Providence had willed that she, Elspeth McGillicuddy, should be a witness of the crime. Her lips set grimly. Voices shouted, whistles blew, doors were banged shut. The 5:38 drew slowly out of Braghampton station. An hour and 5 minutes later, it stopped at Milchester. Mrs. McGillicuddy collected her parcels and her suitcase and got out. She peered up and down the platform. Her mind reiterated its former judgment. Not enough porters. Such porters as there were seemed to be engaged with mail bags and luggage vans. Passengers nowadays seemed always expected to carry their own cases. Well, she couldn't carry her suitcase and her umbrella and all her parcels. She would have to wait. In due course, she secured a porter. "Taxi? There will be something to meet me, I suppose." Outside Milchester station, a taxi driver who had been watching the exit came forward. He spoke in a soft local voice. "Is it Mrs. McGillicuddy for St. Mary Mead?" Mrs. McGillicuddy acknowledged her identity. The porter was recompensed adequately, if not handsomely. The car, with Mrs. McGillicuddy, her suitcase, and her parcels, drove off into the night. It was a 9-mile drive. Sitting bolt upright in the car, Mrs. McGillicuddy was unable to relax. Her feelings yearned for expression. At last the taxi drove along the familiar village street and finally drew up at its destination. Mrs. McGillicuddy got out, walked up the brick path to the door. The driver deposited the cases inside as the door was opened by an elderly maid. Mrs. McGillicuddy paused straight through the hall to where, at the open sitting room, door, her hostess awaited her, an elderly, frail old lady. "Elspeth! Jane!" They kissed, and without preamble or circumlocution, Mrs. McGillicuddy burst into speech. "Oh, Jane," she wailed, "I've just seen a murder!" 450 from Paddington by Agatha Christie. Chapter 2. True to the precepts handed down to her by her mother and grandmother, to wit, that a true lady can neither be shocked nor surprised, Miss Marple merely raised her eyebrows and shook her head as she said, "Most distressing for you, Elspeth, and surely most unusual. I think you had better tell me about it at once." That was exactly what Mrs. McGillicuddy wanted to do. Allowing her hostess to draw her nearer to the fire, she sat down, pulled off her gloves, and plunged into a vivid narrative. Miss Marple listened with close attention. When Miss McGillicuddy at last paused for breath, Miss Marple spoke with decision. "The best thing, I think, my dear, is for you to go upstairs and take off your hat and have a wash. Then we will have supper, during which we will not discuss this at all. After supper, we can go into the matter thoroughly and discuss it from every aspect." Mrs. McGillicuddy concurred with this suggestion. The two ladies had supper, discussing as they ate various aspects of life as lived in the village of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple commented on the general distrust of the new organist, related the recent scandal about the chemist's wife, and touched on the hostility between the schoolmistress and the village institute. They then discussed Miss Marple's and Miss McGillicuddy's gardens. "Peonies," said Miss Marple as she rose from the table, "are most unaccountable. Either they do or they don't do. But if they do establish themselves, they are with you for life, so to speak, and really most beautiful varieties nowadays." They settled themselves by the fire again, and Miss Marple brought out 2 Waterford glasses from the corner cupboard, and from another cupboard produced a bottle. "No coffee tonight for you, Elspeth," she said. "You are already overexcited, and no wonder, and probably would not sleep. I prescribe a glass of my cowslip wine, and later, perhaps, a cup of chamomile tea." Mrs. McGillicuddy acquiescing in these arrangements, Miss Marple poured out the wine. "Jane," said Miss McGillicuddy as she took an appreciative sip, "you don't think, do you, that I dreamt it or imagined it?" "Certainly not," said Miss Marple with warmth. Miss McGillicuddy heaved a sigh of relief. That ticket collector, he thought so. Quite polite, but all the same. "I think, Elspeth, that was quite natural under the circumstances. It sounded, and indeed was, a most unlikely story, and you were a complete stranger to him. No, I have no doubt at all that you saw what you told me that you saw. It's very extraordinary, but not all that impossible. I recollect myself being interested when a train ran parallel to one on which I was traveling, to notice what a vivid and intimate picture one got of what was going on in one or two of the carriages. A little girl, I remember once, playing with a teddy bear, and suddenly she threw it deliberately at a fat man who was asleep in the corner, and he bounced up and looked most indignant, and the other passengers looked so amused. I saw them all quite vividly. I could only have described afterwards exactly what they looked like and what they had on." Mrs. McGillicuddy nodded gratefully. "That's just how it was. The man had his back to you, you say, so you didn't see his face?" "No." "And the woman, you can describe her? Young, old?" "Youngish, between 30 and 35, I should think. I couldn't say closer than that." "Good looking?" "That again, I couldn't say. Her face, you see, was all contorted and—" Miss Marple said quickly, Yes, I quite understand." "How was she dressed?" "She had on a fur coat of some kind, a palish fur. No hat. Her hair was blonde." "And there was nothing distinctive that you can remember about the man?" Mrs. McGillicuddy took a little time to think carefully before she replied. He was tallish and dark, I think. He had a heavy coat on so that I couldn't judge his build very well. She added despondently, "It's not really very much to go on." "It's something," said Miss Marple. She paused before saying, "You feel quite sure in your own mind that the girl was dead?" "She was dead, I'm sure of it. Her tongue came out and I'd rather not talk about it." Of course not," said Miss Marple quickly. "We shall know more, I expect, in the morning." "In the morning?" "I should imagine it will be in the morning papers. After this man had attacked and killed her, he would have a body on his hands. What would he do? Presumably, he would leave the train quickly at the first station. By the way, can you remember if it was a corridor carriage?" "No, it was not." "That seems to point to a train that was not going far afield. It would almost certainly stop at Braghampton. Let us say he leaves the train at Braghampton, perhaps arranging the body in a corner seat with her face hidden by the fur collar to delay discovery. Yes, I think that is what he would do. But of course, it will be discovered before very long, and I should imagine that the news of a murdered woman discovered on a train would almost certainly to be in the morning papers. We shall see." Part 2. But it was not in the morning papers. Miss Marple and Miss McGillicuddy, after making sure this, finished their breakfast in silence. Both were reflecting. After breakfast, they took a turn around the garden, but this, usually an absorbing pastime, was today somewhat half-hearted. Miss Marple did indeed call the attention to some new and rare species she had acquired for her rock garden, but did so in an almost absent-minded manner. And Mrs. McGillicuddy did not, as was customary, counterattack with a list of her own recent acquisitions. "The garden is not looking at all as it should," said Miss Marple, but still speaking absent-mindedly. "Dr. Haydock has absolutely forbidden me to do any stooping or kneeling, and really, what can you do if you don't stoop or kneel? They're all Edwards, of course, but so opinionated. And all this jobbing gets them into bad habits, lots of cup of teas and so much pottering, not any real work." "Oh, I know," said Mrs. McGillicuddy. "Of course, there's no question of my being forbidden to stoop, but really, especially after meals and having put on weight," she looked down her ample proportions, "it does bring on heartburn." There was a silence, and then Mrs. McGillicuddy planted her feet sturdily, stood still, and turned on her friend. "Well?" she said. It was a small, insignificant word, but it was acquired full significance from Mrs. McGillicuddy's tone, and Miss Marple understood its meaning perfectly. "I know," she said. The two ladies looked at each other. "I think," said Miss Marple, "we might walk down to the police station and talk to Sergeant Cornish. He's intelligent and patient, and I know him very well, and he knows me. I think he'll listen and pass the information on to the proper quarter." Accordingly, some 3/4 of an hour later, Miss Marple and Mrs. McGillicuddy were talking to a fresh-faced, grave man between 30 and 40 who listened attentively to what they had to say. Frank Cornish received Miss Marple with cordiality and even deference. He set chairs for the two ladies and said, "Now what can we do for you, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple said, "I would like you, please, to listen to my friend Mrs. McGillicuddy's story." And Sergeant Cornish had listened. At the close of the recital, he remained silent for a moment or two. Then he said, "That's a very extraordinary story." His eyes, without seeming to do so, had sized Mrs. McGillicuddy up whilst she was telling it. On the whole, he was favorably impressed. A sensible woman, able to tell a story clearly, not, so far as he could judge, an over-imaginative or a hysterical woman. Moreover, Miss Marple, so it seemed, believed in the accuracy of her friend's story, and he knew all about Miss Marple. Everybody in St. Mary Mead knew about Miss Marple. Fluffy and dithery in appearance, but inwardly as sharp and as shrewd as they make them. He cleared his throat and spoke. "Of course," he said, "you may have been mistaken. I'm not saying you were, mind, but you may have been. There's a lot of horseplay goes around. It mayn't have been serious or fatal." "I know what I saw," said Mrs. McGillicuddy grimly. "And you won't budge from it," thought Frank Cornish. "And I'd say that, likely or unlikely, you may be right." Aloud he said, "You reported it to the railway officials, and you've come and reported it to me. That's a proper procedure, and you may rely on me to have inquiries instituted." He stopped. Miss Marple nodded her head gently, satisfied. Mrs. McGillicuddy was not quite so satisfied, but she did not say anything. Sergeant Cornish addressed Miss Marple, not so much because he wanted her ideas as because he wanted to hear what she had to say. "Granted the facts are as reported," he said, "what do you think has happened to the body?" "There seems to be only two possibilities," said Miss Marple without hesitation. "The most likely one, of course, is that the body was left in the train, but that seems improbable now, for it would have been found some time last night by another traveler or by the railway staff at the train's ultimate destination." Frank Cornish nodded. "The only other course open to the murderer would be to push the body out of the train onto the line. It must, I suppose, be still on the track somewhere as yet undiscovered, though that does seem a little unlikely. But there would be, as far as I can see, no other way of dealing with it." "You read about bodies being put in trunks," said Mrs. McGillicuddy, "but no one travels with trunks nowadays, only suitcases, and you couldn't get a body into a suitcase." "Yes," said Cornish, "I agree with you both. The body, if there is a body, ought to have been discovered by now, or will be very soon. I'll let you know any developments there are, though I dare say you'll read about them in the papers. There's a possibility, of course, that the woman, though savagely attacked, was not actually dead. She may have been able to leave the train on her own feet." "Hardly without assistance," said Miss Marple, "and if so, it will have been noticed. A man supporting a woman whom he says is very ill." "Yes, it will have been noticed," said Cornish. "Or if a woman was found unconscious or ill in a carriage and was removed to the hospital, that too will be on record. I think you may rest assured that you'll hear about it all in a very short time." But that day passed, and the next day. On that evening, Miss Marple received a note from Sergeant Cornish. "In regard to the matter on which you consulted me, full inquiries have been made with no result. No woman's body has been found, no hospital has administered treatment to a woman such as you describe, and no case of a woman suffering from shock or taken ill or leaving a station supported by a man has been observed. You may take it that the fullest inquiries have been made. I suggest that your friend may have witnessed a scene such as she described, but that it was much less serious than she supposed." 450 from Paddington by Agatha Christie, Chapter 3. "Less serious? Fiddlesticks!" said Mrs. McGillicuddy. "It was murder!" She looked defiantly at Miss Marple, and Miss Marple looked back at her. "Go on, Jane," said Mrs. McGillicuddy. "Say it was all a mistake. Say I imagined the whole thing. That's what you think now, isn't it?" "Anyone can be mistaken," Miss Marple pointed out gently. "Anybody, Elspeth, even you. I think we must bear that in mind. But I think, you know, that you were most probably not mistaken. You use glasses for reading, but you've got very good farsight, and what you saw impressed you very powerfully. You were definitely suffering from shock when you arrived here." "It's a thing I shall never forget," said Mrs. McGillicuddy with a shudder. "The trouble is, I don't see what I can do about it." "I don't think," Miss Marple thoughtfully said, "that there's anything more you can do about it." If Mrs. McGillicuddy had been alert to the tones of her friend's voice, she might have noticed a very faint stress laid on the "you." "You've reported what you saw to the railway people and to the police. No, there's nothing more you can do." "That's a relief in a way," said Mrs. McGillicuddy, "because, as you know, I'm going out to Ceylon immediately after Christmas to stay with Roderick, and I certainly do not want to put that visit off. I've been looking forward to it so much, though of course I would put it off if I thought it was my duty," she added conscientiously. I'm sure you would, Elspeth, but as I say, I consider you've done everything you possibly could do. It's up to the police, said Mrs. McGillicuddy, and if the police choose to be stupid. Miss Marple shook her head decisively. Oh, no, the police aren't stupid, and that makes it interesting, doesn't it? Mrs. McGillicuddy looked at her without comprehension, and Miss Marple reaffirmed her judgment of her friend as a woman of excellent principles and no imagination. One wants to know, said Miss Marple, what really happened. She was killed. Yes, but who killed her, and why? And what happened to the body? Where is it now? That's the business of the police to find out. Exactly, and they haven't found out. That means, doesn't it, that the man was clever, very clever. I can't imagine, said Miss Marple, knitting her brows, how he disposed of it. You kill a woman in a fit of passion. It must have been unpremeditated. You'd never choose to kill a woman in such circumstances, just a few minutes before running into a big station. No, it must have been a quarrel, jealousy, something of that kind. You strangle her, and there you are, as I say, with a dead body on your hands, and on the point of running into a station. What could you do except, as I said at first, prop the body up in a corner as though asleep, hiding the face, and then yourself leave the train as quickly as possible? I don't see any other possibility, and yet there must have been one. Miss Marple lost herself in thought. Mrs. McGillicuddy spoke to her twice before Miss Marple answered. You're getting deaf, Jane. Just a little, perhaps. People do not seem to me to enunciate their words as clearly as they used to. But it wasn't that I did not hear you. I'm afraid I wasn't paying attention. I just asked about the trains to London tomorrow. Would the afternoon be all right? I'm going to Margaret's, and she isn't expecting me before tea time. I wonder, Elspeth, if you would mind going up by the 12:15. We could have an early lunch. Of course, and Miss Marple went on, drowning her friend's words. And I wondered, too, if Margaret would mind if you didn't arrive for tea. If you arrived about 7, perhaps? Mrs. McGillicuddy looked at her friend curiously. What's on your mind, Jane? I suggest, Elspeth, that I should travel up to London with you, and that we should travel down again as far as Brackhampton in the train you traveled by the other day. You would then return to London from Brackhampton, and I would come on here as you did. I, of course, would pay the fares. Miss Marple stressed this point firmly. Mrs. McGillicuddy ignored the financial aspect. What on earth do you expect, Jane? Another murder? Certainly not, said Miss Marple, shocked. But I confess I should like to see for myself, under your guidance, really, it is most difficult to find the correct terms, the terrain of the crime. So accordingly, on the following day, Miss Marple and Mrs. McGillicuddy found themselves in two opposite corners of a first-class carriage speeding out of London by the 4:50 from Paddington. Paddington had been even more crowded than on the preceding Friday, as there was now only 2 days to go before Christmas, but the 4:50 was comparatively peaceful, at any rate in the rear portion. On this occasion, no train drew level with them, or they had another train. At intervals, trains flashed past them towards London. On 2 occasions, trains flashed past them the other way, going at high speed. At intervals, Mrs. McGillicuddy consulted her watch doubtfully. It's hard to tell just when we'd pass through a station, I know. But they were continuously passing through stations. We're due in Brackhampton in 5 minutes, said Miss Marple. A ticket collector appeared in the doorway. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows interrogatively. Mrs. McGillicuddy shook her head. It was not the same ticket collector. He clipped their tickets and passed on, staggering just a little as the train swung round a long curve. It slackened speed as it did so. I expect we're coming into Brackhampton, said Miss McGillicuddy. We're getting into the outskirts, I think, said Miss Marple. There were lights flashing past outside, buildings, an occasional glimpse of streets and trams. Their speed slackened further. They began crossing points. "We'll be there in a minute," said Mrs. McGillicuddy, "and I can't really see this journey has been any good at all. Has it suggested anything to you, Jane?" "I'm afraid not," said Miss Marple in a rather doubtful voice. "A sad waste of good money," said Mrs. McGillicuddy, but with less disapproval than she would have used had she been paying for herself. Miss Marple had been quite adamant on that point. "All the same," said Miss Marple, "one likes to see with one's own eyes where a thing happened. This train's just a few minutes late. Was yours on time on Friday?" "I think so. I didn't really notice." The train drew slowly into the busy length of Brighthampton Station. The loudspeaker announced hoarsely, doors opened and shut. People got in and out, milled up and down the platform. It was a busy, crowded scene. Easy, thought Miss Marple, for a murderer to merge into the crowd, to leave the station in the midst of that pressing mass of people, or even to select another carriage and go in the train wherever its ultimate destination might be. Easy to be one male passenger amongst many, but not so easy to make a body vanish into thin air. That body must be somewhere. Mrs. McGillicuddy had descended. She spoke now from the platform through the open window. "Now take care of yourself, Jane," she said. "Don't catch a chill. It's a nasty, treacherous time of the year, and you're not so young as you were." "I know," said Miss Marple. "And don't let's worry ourselves any more over all this. We've done what we could." Miss Marple nodded and said, "Don't stand there in the cold, Elspeth, or you'll be the one to catch a chill. Go and get yourself a good hot cup of tea in the restaurant room. You've got time, 12 minutes before your train back to town." "I think perhaps I will. Goodbye, Jane." "Goodbye, Elspeth. A happy Christmas to you. I hope you find Margaret well, and enjoy yourself in Ceylon. And give my love to dear Roderick, if he remembers me at all, which I doubt." "Of course he remembers you very well. You helped him in some way when he was at school, something to do with money that was disappearing from a locker. He's never forgotten it." "Oh, that," said Miss Marple. Mrs. McGillicuddy turned away. A whistle blew. The train began to move. Miss Marple watched the sturdy, thick-set body of her friend recede. Elspeth could go to Ceylon with a clear conscience. She had done her duty and was freed from further obligation. Miss Marple did not lean back as the train gathered speed. Instead, she sat upright and devoted herself seriously to thought. Though in speech Miss Marple was woolly and diffuse, in mind she was clear and sharp. She had a problem to solve, the problem of her own future conduct, and, perhaps strangely, it presented itself to her as it had to Mrs. McGillicuddy, as a question of duty. Mrs. McGillicuddy had said that they had both done all they could do. It was true of Mrs. McGillicuddy, but about herself Miss Marple did not feel so sure. It was a question sometimes of using one's special gifts, but perhaps that was conceited. After all, what could she do? Her friend's words came back to her. "You're not so young as you were." Dispassionately, like a general planning a campaign, or an accountant assessing a business, Miss Marple weighed up and down and set in her mind the facts of and against further enterprise. On the credit side were the following. 1. My long experience of life and human nature. 2. Sir Henry Clithering and his godson, now at Scotland Yard, I believe, who was so very nice in the little Paddocks case. 3. My nephew Raymond's second boy, David, who is, I am almost sure, in British Railways. 4. Griselda's boy Leonard, who is so very knowledgeable about maps. Miss Marple reviewed these assets and approved them. They were all very necessary to reinforce the weaknesses on the debit side, in particular her own bodily weaknesses. It is not, thought Miss Marple, as though I could go there, and everywhere, making inquiries and finding out things. Yes, that was the chief objection, her own age and weakness. Although, for her age, her health was good, yet she was old, and if Dr. Haydock had strictly forbidden her to do practical gardening, he would hardly approve of her starting her own track down a murder. For that, in effect, was what she was planning to do, and it was there that her loophole lay. For if heretofore murder had, so to speak, been forced upon her, in this case it would be that she herself had set out deliberately to seek it, and she was not sure that she wanted to do so. She was old and tired. She felt at this moment, at the end of a tiring day, a great reluctance to enter upon any project at all. She wanted nothing at all but to march home and sit by the fire with a nice tray of supper and go to bed and potter about the next day, just snipping off a few things in the garden, tidying up in a very mild way, without stooping, without exerting herself. "I'm too old for any more adventures," said Miss Marple to herself, watching absently out the window the curving line of an embankment, a curve. Very faintly something stirred in her mind. Just after the ticket collector had clipped their tickets, it suggested an idea, only an idea, an entirely different idea. A little pink flush came into Miss Marple's face. Suddenly, she did not feel very tired at all. "I'll write to David tomorrow morning," she said to herself, and at the same time another valuable asset flashed through her mind. Of course, my faithful Florence.